Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I really do appreciate you being part of this. And remember, you can email me, contact me with any questions or concerns that you have. I want to look at a new book, at least new for me. I think it's been out 4 or 5 years, by Brant Pitre, I believe is the way he pronounces his name. It's called The Case for Jesus, subtitled The Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. And just to give you an idea of what people have been saying, Craig Keener, I find him to be a really exceptional apologist and theologian. He said, Brant in this book, quote, explains here in remarkably easy to understand ways why we can trust the Gospels. Behind his effective communication, however, is wide-ranging research and careful rethinking. In fact, this book has given me a number of important new matters to consider myself. So this book is looking at all sorts of things to do with Jesus, especially some of the criticisms that have been going on for a long time. So it covers good questions like, were the Gospels anonymous? That's a charge. What about the titles? Where'd those come from for the Gospels? What did the early church fathers say about the Gospels? Then you got the lost Gospels. What about them? Are the Gospels biographies? In other words, is it folklore or is it legit? How about the dating of the Gospels? How old are they? How close are they to the time of Jesus? And then Jesus as Messiah. Does he really fulfill some of the messianic prophecies? Did Jesus think he was God? Boy, is that crucial, huh? And the crucifixion and the resurrection, and the last part is called at Caesarea Philippi, which is really good. So let's do this. I'm going to come back to this way more than one podcast. This is such a good book. Let's go to the early chapter here. Were the Gospels anonymous? And so he said, we're in an interesting situation here. How do we know what we know about Jesus? You know, what kind of certainty can we have about what he did and what he said? So he said, well, a lot of people say just open up the Gospels, right? You look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they tell us what Jesus did and said. And he said, yeah, for about 19 centuries, most Christians believe the Gospels of Matthew and John were written by eyewitnesses. Then you have Gospel of Mark and Luke were written by companions of the apostles Peter and Paul. But he said there's been a new theory that's come onto the scene. And according to this theory, those ideas, those traditional ideas about who wrote the Gospels are really not true. Instead, what do we get? The idea that the 4 Gospels were originally anonymous. And form critics came up with that idea in the early 20th century. So, of course, the favorite person to go to today to find out what are the critics saying is Bart Ehrman. Ehrman's got an interesting history. You might want to take a look at that. He says he started out as a pretty traditional evangelical Christian, and then he lost his faith, especially due to things like evil and suffering and things like that. But anyway, you can take a look. Anyway, he is so popular these days. His books sell well. And he is a textual critic. He looks at the ancient manuscript evidence. And what's interesting about Ehrman is that he will say things that do have an element of truth. He's a good scholar, so he'll say things that are true, but he leaves out a lot of information that actually undermines what he has to say. Okay, well, with that as a background, that's Bart Ehrman, E-H-R-M-A-N. You'll see his name a lot of different places. YouTube. Take a look. He does a lot of debates with people like Dan Wallace, and you'd probably find that really interesting. Anyway, so recently Ehrman put out a book, How Jesus Became God. Did you hear that title? How Jesus Became God. In other words, he wasn't God, and that over the centuries, the church turned him into God. Okay, so that's his idea. And he says, this is Ehrman now, all 4 Gospels were put out without any titles. No headings. You couldn't tell who the authors were. There was no Gospel according to Matthew or Gospel according to Mark. None. They were just blanks. And said the original Gospel authors were deliberately keeping their identities hidden. And then, all right, next step. All 4 Gospels circulated for about a century without any titles before anybody started putting Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John on them. So Third, right, here's the next step. It was only a long time after the disciples of Jesus were dead and buried that titles got added. And why? Because it gave those Gospels authority. So it was a deliberate attempt, actually, to deceive people, because they'd see a title, the Gospel according to Matthew. They go, oh, Matthew hung out with Jesus. Gosh, this is true. This is legit. I'll trust this. But he said, no, he said it was a deliberate attempt to deceive readers, to think that the Gospels were written by apostles and their disciples. And then, according to that theory, Ehrman also says, because the Gospels are anonymous, none of them, right, none of those four was actually written by an eyewitness. Now, that's the crucial part, isn't it? So it doesn't really matter what name is on it, but if you can say, well, but they weren't written until long after eyewitnesses were dead, then how do we know what they said was true about Jesus? So there's the theory. That's what's out there, the theory of the anonymous Gospels. He said it's widespread. Scholars and non-scholars alike. Of course, he says it's emphasized by people who want to cast doubts on the historical reliability that we get about Jesus in the four Gospels. So the author, so we're coming back to Brandt here. Brandt says, the only problem with the theory, it's just got one problem. It's almost completely baseless. It has no foundation in the earliest manuscripts. It's, in fact, it says, he says it fails to take seriously how ancient books were copied and circulated. He says it suffers from what he calls historical plausibility, a lack of it. So he says, let's look at these three problems. So, number one, what's the biggest problem for this theory? And I ended up underlining this seriously. No anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. They don't exist. He says, as far as we know, they never have. Wow. And he's got a chart here, which is fascinating, on page 16. No anonymous gospel. So he goes back and he shows you a list of the earliest Greek manuscripts going back to the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries. And guess what? Every one of them, all these papyri and the codexes, they all say gospel according to fill in the blank, either Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. So he said, look at that list. He said, there is no anonymous gospel manuscript. He said, you know why? They don't exist. Not even one. So he said, when it comes to the title of the Gospels, for their titles, he says it's not just the earliest and the best manuscripts, but he says, and this is in italics, all of the ancient manuscripts, he says without exception, in every language, attribute the four Gospels to, you ready? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He quotes a New Testament scholar, Michael Bird. There is absolute uniformity, he says, in the authors that each book is attributed to. So he said, take a look at that. He says, now Bart Ehrman says, well, he says, we have a wide variety of titles for the Gospels. He says, really? What's the wide variety? He said, the only difference is some of them say the Gospel is missing. In other words, one will say the Gospel according to Matthew, another one will say according to Matthew, one will say the Gospel according to Mark, another one may say according to Mark. But he says they all attribute those four names. They're found in every single manuscript we possess, those four. He says, notice the titles are present in the most ancient copies that we have. So he says, in summary, what's he saying here? The earliest and best copies of the four Gospels are unanimously attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no evidence at all that they first came out without titles. Okay, so that's good. Here's the second problem, he says. So the first problem is that we can't find any of these so-called anonymous Gospels. Here's the second problem. He says that theory about the anonymous Gospels. He says it's really implausible. He said, now catch this. If this was true, you have this anonymous gospel and it's going all over the place, and then scribes throughout the Roman Empire who have not talked to each other come up and agree that this one was by Matthew and the other one was by Mark and so on. So he said, picture this. You got this anonymous book. Let's take the Gospel of Matthew. So this book is copied by hand, and it's recopied, and it's recopied. It goes throughout the Roman Empire for years and years and years. And he says sometime in the early 2nd century, the exact same titles are supposedly added to all 4 of these very different anonymous books. Now, they've been spread throughout the Roman Empire. They're all over the place. So he said, how did these unknown scribes add the titles to the books that the other scribes are putting the titles to? How'd they communicate with each other? So they would say, look, let's all call this one Matthew, right? So you get the story of the birth of Jesus. Or the book of Luke, right? You get the Song of Mary. How'd they all know, say, okay, let's make that one that has a Song of Mary. Let's call that Luke. And he said, all these Gospels, how did they do that? So he said, there are multiple Gospels circulating. He says, why don't some copies that are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, why aren't others attributed to somebody else, like maybe Andrew or Peter or Jude? If they just had scribes sitting around falsely adding names, why wouldn't we find some anonymous copies and some contradictory titles? We don't find that. He says, compare that, for example, to the evidence for the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. Now, that really is anonymous. He said it has no identification of the author, not even in the title. So we get this anonymous book that people have wrestled with. And it says some people say it was by Timothy, some say by Paul, and so there's a controversy over that. So it says, look at that. The scholars that claim the Gospels are anonymous can't explain why we don't have a whole bunch of different suggested authors like we do with the letter to the Hebrews. Here's a third problem with these anonymous Gospel ideas. Here's the third problem. That these false attributions were added. Remember, this is the theory. They were added a century later. Why? To give the Gospels what they were calling much-needed authority. Really? So here are these anonymous Gospels. So somebody sits down and says, look, we got to put names on them. And let's put names on them that'll give the church great credibility, right? It'll give it a real high standing, these Gospels. But here's his question. If that's what they did, why would they name 2 of the 4 Gospels according to non-eyewitnesses? Why would they pick Mark and Luke? They never even knew Jesus. So if you want authority, if you want certainty, if you want people to buy into your gospel, why wouldn't you attribute, he says, your anonymous gospel like to Peter or to Andrew? Well, why not go right to the top and say the gospel according to Jesus? Now, there are apocryphal gospels. Right? There are some who have given the name of Peter and Thomas and Judas, but they're forgeries. They were falsely attributed to the disciples long after the disciples were dead. None of the later apocryphal Gospels are attributed to non-eyewitnesses like Mark and Luke. It says the authors of the apocryphal Gospels wanted to give authority to their writings, so they definitely came up with something there to make them look better. Okay, second chapter that I would like to look at here. I've got a few more minutes, if that's okay. He says, let's look at the internal and the external evidence for the titles. So he says, let's start with Matthew, right? So we got the book of Matthew. Who's Matthew? Well, Jesus calls Matthew to leave behind his life as a tax collector and go with him. And it says, notice this. The first gospel is attributed to the only one of Jesus' apostles who would likely have been literate. He could read and write, right? Because he was a tax collector. Now, it's kind of interesting. It says it's true that other disciples were fishermen, and they were not from the elite classes of Jewish society. And in fact, in Acts, Peter and John are described as uneducated. Okay, we'll come back to that later, but notice at least one of Jesus' disciples was literate. It had to be Matthew. Okay, so it says there is a problem that people will try to point out, some objection to Matthew having written the gospel. Why? Because a lot of people think the Gospel of Matthew used Mark as his source. But he said there's good reasons to conclude the Gospel of Mark is based on the testimony of the Apostle Peter, so we can catch that another time. Then you've got Mark, right? He was, in the letters of Paul, he was a man of the circumcision, meaning he was Jewish. He was a cousin of Barnabas, and he stayed with Paul and traveled with him, so we know quite a bit about him. It says the main point is that John Mark was a well-known and well-connected man in the early church. Okay, move along. Third one, Luke. Okay, we find out in Philemon and Colossians and others, he was called in Colossians, for example, Luke, the beloved physician. And it says it has an interesting prologue in it. It says why he was doing that writing. And by the way, take a look at that prologue. That'd be Luke 1 through 4. His gospel is not the first one to be written. What does he say? He says many others had composed narratives. And he's admitting he was not an eyewitness, but he emphasizes that his account was based on people who were eyewitnesses. And then he dedicates the book to Theophilus, right? And it's written by the same person who authored the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so there are good reasons to identify this as Luke being the author of Acts and a traveling companion of Paul. So let's, how about John? Okay, the one who lay his head on the chest of Jesus at the Last Supper, and he was seated closer to Jesus at the Last Supper. He's the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 disciples. He was part of an innermost circle around Jesus. But people say, well, it's kind of odd. If John is the son of Zebedee, why does he refer to himself in kind of an anonymous way? Right? So he's his third person. But it said he'll say the disciple whom Jesus loved instead of saying me. But some people say, well, maybe it was to invite readers of the gospel to see themselves in him. Then people say, well, wait a minute, though. If he's a fisherman, how could he write the Gospels? He'd be illiterate. But it said, wait a minute, nobody's actually claiming that a fisherman wrote the Gospel. It was written by an ex-fisherman who'd become a student of arguably the most influential Jewish rabbi in history. And he may have spoken and written and done things for a long, long time, preaching and teaching, before even putting down a single word. Plus, notice his father. It says his father in Mark 1, it says they left their father in the boat with a hired servant. So he possibly was educated. So back one more time about that illiterate part, right? That's in Acts 4. Peter and John are called uneducated, right? Perceived that they are uneducated common men. So some people say, oh, so these guys don't know anything. But he said, wait a minute. It's in a broader sense. It just indicates they lacked a formal education. So he references a Greek writer, Epictetus, speaking about a man writing in an illiterate way. So the description of Peter and John may just say they lacked formal scribal literacy of the kind possessed by those leaders. And then finally, even if John really didn't read or write, he still could have authored that gospel. Why? Because there was a really common first century custom. You dictated to a secretary. I mean, even Paul did that. He was literate. He dictated his letter to the Romans to a scribe Tertius. You can see that in Romans 16. And we see in different places the use of secretaries in 1 Corinthians 16 and Galatians 6, and sometimes co-authors, 1 Corinthians 1, 2 Corinthians 1, Philippians 1, 1 Thessalonians 1, Philemon 1. So Richard Bachman, who's done a lot of study on the Gospels, he says the description of the beloved disciple as having written the Gospel could refer to the dictation of a text to a scribe. And so that may be the case as well. Okay, well, I'll stop there, but boy, this is a wonderful book. I've ended up just saying to my wife about every 10 minutes, hey, listen to this, hey, listen to this. Some good things in here, and I want to get back to them. Plenty of interesting insights into the Gospels. Well, thanks again for being part of this. I hope you check this book out. It's very easy to read, and a lot of challenging ideas in here. Excellent writer. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast. Hope you're having a good day.